At 35, the table is covered with bills he can't ignore anymore. At 19, swiping a card felt easier than saying no. At 35, the numbers on the screen feel heavier than they should. At 19, those sneakers looked worth every borrowed dollar. At 35, every envelope in the mailbox carries bad news. At 19, late-night shopping felt like harmless fun. At 35, he sits across from a banker explaining why payments stopped. At 19, signing the first credit card form felt like freedom. At 35, unknown numbers bring the same uncomfortable question. At 19, every purchase felt like a celebration. At 35, he calculates bills again and again, hoping the math changes. At 19, a new gaming console felt like a reward he deserved. At 35, reminders arrive faster than paychecks. At 19, buy now, pay later sounded like a perfect deal. At 35, silence fills the room along with unpaid statements. At 19, expensive clothes felt like confidence. At 35, the bank balance barely moves anymore. At 19, the newest phone seemed impossible to resist. At 35, arguments about money echo through the house. At 19, parties felt more important than saving. At 35, loan documents pile up like unfinished chapters. At 19, multiple credit cards felt like opportunity. At 35, he sits in a bank office discussing repayment plans. At 19, gadgets bought on installments felt harmless. At 35, interest grows quietly every month. At 19, paying only the minimal bill seemed smart enough. At 35, a letter warns about the future of his home. At 19, the expensive apartment felt like independence. At 35, the debt calculator shows a number he never expected. At 19, spending freely felt normal. At 35, the night becomes a quiet battle with financial reality. At 19, trendy clothes seemed like small purchases. At 35, a phone call reminds him the debt is still waiting. At 19, dinners in luxury restaurants felt like living fully. At 35, every paycheck disappears into loan payments. At 19, online shopping deliveries felt exciting. At 35, the quiet room carries the weight of regret. At 19, subscriptions felt cheap enough to ignore. At 35, interest rates quietly grow into something dangerous. At 19, small personal loans felt easy to manage. At 35, overdue notices arrive like reminders of past choices. At 19, tracking spending never felt necessary. At 35, frustration grows heavier with every statement. At 19, gadgets felt like happiness in a box. At 35, the apartment feels smaller under financial pressure. At 19, sales and discounts felt like opportunities. At 35, bank statements reveal years of careless spending. At 19, loan apps felt like instant solutions. At 35, bills surround him like silent accusations. At 19, swiping a card felt effortless. At 35, the laptop shows numbers that refuse to shrink. At 19, designer shoes looked like success. At 35, another bill joins the growing pile. At 19, daily food delivery felt normal. At 35, financial advice becomes a necessity. At 19, learning about money felt boring. At 35, every payment feels like climbing uphill. At 19, entertainment spending felt harmless. At 35, his credit score becomes a constant worry. At 19, installment plans looked manageable. At 35, the dining table becomes a financial battlefield. At 19, expensive headphones felt like a small luxury.
At 35, conversations about money grow tense. At 19, nightlife felt like living the moment. At 35, the repayment schedule feels endless. At 19, sales felt impossible to ignore. At 35, deadlines approach faster every month. At 19, minimum payments seemed enough. At 35, silence replaces financial confidence. At 19, tracking expenses felt unnecessary. At 35, the total loan amount feels overwhelming. At 19, luxury purchases felt justified. At 35, credit card statements multiply. At 19, applying for another card felt normal. At 35, negotiations with the bank become routine. At 19, loan apps felt like easy money. At 35, the math of debt never sleeps. At 19, streaming subscriptions felt cheap. At 35, anxiety grows quietly every month. At 19, the latest gadgets always felt necessary. At 35, warning letters arrive more often. At 19, late-night shopping became a habit. At 35, loan alerts never stop appearing. At 19, luxury clothes felt like confidence. At 35, debt reports reveal the full picture. At 19, budgeting never seemed urgent. At 35, financial advisors explain hard truths. At 19, saving money felt like something for later. At 35, the total debt amount finally sinks in. At 19, big sales felt like perfect timing. At 35, another sleepless night passes with unpaid bills. At 19, trendy fashion purchases felt exciting. At 35, bank notices fill the mailbox again. At 19, credit cards felt like unlimited freedom. At 35, exhaustion replaces financial dreams. At 19, upgrades felt like progress. At 35, debt papers surround him like a reminder. At 19, luxury purchases impressed friends. At 35, the final number reveals the true cost of small decisions. Because the debt at 35 quietly began at 19.